In Live on Live this afternoon, I'm joined in the studio by Georges Lory, former diplomat in Pretoria, who has been translating the works of South African authors into French since the 1970s, most notably the acclaimed novelist, the 2003 Nobel Literature Prize winner, John Maxwell Coetzee. You're very welcome to the programme, Georges.
Thank you.
Now, let's have a look here. You've been translating South African authors from English and Afrikaans since 1975, and you were posted to Pretoria in the early 1990s, before the end of apartheid. But you also spent time at the University of Stellenbosch in Western Cape Province prior to all of this experience. But tell us about your experience there at the height of the apartheid era in the mid-70s.
Exactly. Those were triumphant years for apartheid. And I was lucky to see that from Stellenbosch, which is the heart of Afrikaandom. All the elite of the Afrikaners would send their kids to Stellenbosch. That was a most interesting time. And what struck me most is that it was possible not to meet any blacks. It was so organized that you really had to dig if you wanted to see another South Africa.
And what made you choose Stellenbosch to actually go there? Why did you choose this place? It was a big challenge for somebody in the 1970s to do so.
Indeed, politically, first of all, and then secondly, I spoke Dutch, and I was interested by Afrikaans. Afrikaans actually is a Creole from Dutch, and it was quite easy, I must say, to learn Afrikaans. Easy in terms of grammar, but also I must say that the creativity of Afrikaans is most interesting. They have the ability of creating new words which in French we don't have. So I like to learn that language.
And it will tell us about this. Why did you have Dutch? You translate indeed from English and Afrikaans, but you already spoke Flemish. How was that, seeing that you're 100% French?
True. My father moved to Bruges when I was 2, and there are no French schools in Bruges, so I had my schools in Dutch, with a Flemish accent, because it's Flanders. And then later on, I was sent to Brussels, but I kept courses in Dutch.
And I take it that let's look back to that period, that progressive South African literature would have been very hard to come by in South Africa under apartheid rule. What outlets were actually getting South African literature out at that time? And why did you tune into South African writing?
Because I liked the works and the books I've read, so that was a starting point. But
where did you find the books? Where did you access the books?
Well, strangely, many were not forbidden. They were not displayed very easily, but you could find them. And I was so surprised when I was in Stellenbosch in 1974 to learn that the biggest Afrikaans poet was living in Paris. I had no clue about that. So my first step back in Paris was to interview Breitenbach. And a few months later, I read in the newspaper that he was jailed. So I went to see the Breitenbach committee in Paris, and they knew him as a painter, but not as a poet. So they asked me to translate a few of his poems, and slowly it began a whole volume.
So that's where it all started. Indeed, I've mentioned JMCoetzee as one of the notable authors that you have translated. And of course, you mentioned Breitenbach. You've got Dian Meyer under your belt, also Nadine Gordimer and Njabulu Ndebele. In translating, this is the whole thing. You've got a wide palette here of translations that you've done. In translating different authors with different styles of writing, is it essential to have met them in person to get an idea of the nuances that are required from taking it from one language into French?
I think it's important. Personally, I like the writers, so I like translating their works. That helps a lot. And then you have this possibility in your mind to say, if I'm really stuck, I can send them an email and ask for what nuance you would prefer. And that's what they actually did. And mind you, John Coetzee and Nadine Gordimer Brayton, of course, because he's 100% fluent in French. But all three of them had very fine knowledge of French. Though we only spoke English with Nadine Gordimer and with John, I could write in French and they would answer me in English, which makes things so easy.
Much easier. So you were able to cut to a chase there. And of course, with somebody like Coetzee, who himself gave his PhD dissertation on the works of Samuel Beckett, did you feel obliged to maybe read up on Samuel Beckett before you translated anything from Coetzee?
Not at all.
Okay, not at all. So you don't have to be a Beckett scholar to actually access any of the works for translation. Because, I mean, Beckett himself, as you know, he lived here in Paris. He wrote a lot of his works in French as well. But moving away then from that aspect, you've translated into French now a collection of Coetzee's short stories. This is called L'Abattoir de Verre. This is coming out under the Seuil is the name of the publication company. Tell us about this compilation. What's it all about?
It's a group of 7 short stories written by Coetzee between 2003 and 2018, something like that. But there is a logic within the book. There is a main character called Elizabeth Costello. She appeared previously in a book called precisely Elizabeth Costello. She's an Australian academic, maverick, and she says things that people wouldn't like to hear, like African writers are writing for Western audiences, which is true. And she also was already committed in cruelty against animals, especially on a philosophical basis. So Coetzee goes back to those themes, and he shows Costello on her late years, slowly being not so fit, and but always asking difficult questions, and always very committed into the defense of
the rights
of animals.
Animal rights, rights, which of course is very dear to Coetzee's heart as well.
Exactly.
He's become very active in that since he himself moved to Australia, and he took Australian citizenship only a few years back. You know Coetzee personally. I mean, he has a bit of a reputation of being a recluse and, you know, quite stoical and can sit through maybe wine parties or book launches without saying a word. But you know personally, how would you describe him?
He's réservé, as we say in French.
Yeah, he's reserved. I mean,
reserved.
Yeah.
I was asked by a friend of his who I knew to go and cycle the three of us together because, as the friend put it, we don't say a word. Perhaps if you join us, John will be more talkative. But it didn't happen that way. John was first and we were behind him talking. Mm-hmm. But he's quite open, and we trained for the Argus cycle race in Cape Town. He did very well, and he joined us every year for the party afterwards. He was very smiling and open. He's a good man in company. He's not reclusive.
Okay, so I mean, he does come out of his shell from time to time,
yes.
Basically. Now, let's look at the 1999 novel that he wrote called Disgrace. Coetzee allegorizes, if you will, South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it was criticized for depicting racial stereotypes and said it was not indicative of, let's say, the Rainbow Nation under construction at the time, and it also led to a spat with former President Thabo Mbeki, who felt compelled to underline that South Africa is not only a place of rape. Now, there was a certain thing in context there because Coetzee himself was lambasting South Africa for the level of violence. But how was that novel received by South Africans on the ground? How did they respond to the novel Disgrace about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
Well, it was ambivalent. Some of them liked it a lot, and indeed, I must say, I've read the book 10 years later, and it still is accurate and fine and well written, very fluid. I must say, it's a masterpiece. then many South Africans were a bit surprised to see that if you have to be raped to be allowed in the country, it's a very difficult situation, and that therefore they rejected it. I think black readers were quite upset with that.
Mm-hmm. So there wasn't a magnanimous conclusion across both racial boundaries, if you will, that the book was great or other. It's still kept within its certain.
There is no doubt it's a masterpiece, and the Nobel Prize came a few years later.
On the basis
Not
of
surprisingly.
that. Indeed. Now, let's look a little bit to the future. I mean, we have to look at contemporary South African literature. I mean, what kind of following does it have here, and who are the bright stars on the horizon that we should be looking out for?
Well, you mentioned Jambulu Ndebele, but he's now a young star. He's in his 70s, very active. I have actually translated The Cry of Winnie Mandela into French, but it's not yet published. Ndebele is a very open-minded man who always criticized some behaviors within the black community. Of course, everyone was against apartheid. That doesn't mean you should behave like a bully.
Indeed. And just when we look back to the authors that we've mentioned there, and now we're looking to the future or more books that are coming out, have recent political and social events and the turmoil following, especially the Zuma presidency in South Africa, given any, inspiration to these writers? Are they talking about contemporary issues now?
They still do. It's a bit too short notice. After all, Ramaphosa is only in office since February.
Exactly a few months.
But obviously, when I was there recently, there is some hope. They don't think Ramaphosa will change drastically the situation, but at least corruption should be fought more efficiently than previously.
Okay, Georges Lory, who is the translator of JMCoetzee L'Abattoir de Verre, that's the 7 short stories, is in the latest edition by Seuil Publications. Thank you very much for being on the programme today.
Thank you.